Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for American Progress, I want to thank you, each of you, for joining us for this critical event. We're incredibly honored to welcome back Colorado Senator Michael Bennet to have an important discussion about one of the most critical issues facing us. During his time in Congress, Senator Bennet has established himself as a dynamic voice for progressive values. He's been a tireless champion and just recently been doing incredible work to defend the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. He's also reached across the aisle to work on important issues like comprehensive immigration reform and protecting the rights of undocumented families. He's played a key role in strengthening America's education system so that it works for every child, and an area that's been close to his heart since his time as superintendent of Denver's public schools. Senator Bennet has made it his mission to put the concerns of hardworking American families at the center of an agenda in Washington, an agenda that is often dominated by special interests and too often dominated by corporations and people who have a voice at the expense of others. That's why he's had the courage to speak on incredibly important issues that many have been unwilling to address. Political reform, reform of Congress, who Congress speaks for, who Congress works for. These are critical issues that he has championed, and I think it is basically from a sense that the lack of trust people have, the lack of faith they have in their political institutions is fundamentally eroding our democracy and fundamentally making us incapable of making important decisions. That's why this work is so important and why we've been honored to work with him on these critical issues. He's been in a unique position in a purple state, working on ending dysfunction and restore essentially at the very basic nature responsiveness to our political system. No easy task, but one even in these polarizing times we think is more important than ever. So it is my great honor to welcome to the podium Senator Michael Bennet for an important discussion on these issues.
Well, thank you. It's nice. It's really nice to be back. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy day to be here. Neera, thank you for that. That introduction is so much nicer than the bio on my website that I may steal it for that purpose. And I want to be brief at the outset because I'd much rather spend the time in a conversation with all of you about what you want to talk about. There are a few things I wanted to say, though, in this week when we did have a great success, which was stopping the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. This is a bill that I've said the Affordable Care Act isn't perfect. There are things in it that I would really like to fix. In particular, just one small area that relates to 7% of the people in this country that are insured in the individual market and who are seeing huge volatility in their insurance. It's absolutely true. People come up to me at home and they say, hey, you voted for the Affordable Care Act. And I say, yep. And they say, well, here's the problem. I am paying too much for insurance because there's no competition in my area. This tends to happen in rural areas. And so I'm paying too much for insurance, and the deductible is higher than it should be. It's worthless to my family. Why would you make me buy something that's worthless to my family? To which I say, you're absolutely right. That's a fair criticism. We should fix that problem. And we were embarked on a process to fix that problem in the Health, Education, and Labor Committee with Lamar Alexander, whom I cherish, and Patty Murray, who's the ranking member, two of the best legislators we have in the Congress to fix it. Now, we started to get down the road, and all of a sudden people realized that if we were fixing the Affordable Care Act, it meant that we weren't repealing the Affordable Care Act. And that would not satisfy the campaign promise that had been made over and over again and then manifested in the 65 repeal votes that the Republican House had while President Obama was still president of the United States, votes that allowed them to go home and say, see, I'm repealing the Affordable Care Act, even though it never was really being repealed. That time also was not spent trying to figure out what an alternative might be to the Affordable Care Act, is something that we've learned. And so what that generated was a first attempt to repeal the bill with a bill that if I set out to write a bill less responsive to the critics of Obamacare in Colorado. I could not have written a bill less responsive than the one the House and Senate failed to pass before, until I wrote this bill. And the only reason I wouldn't say it was less responsive is that at least this bill didn't cut the taxes from the wealthiest Americans in a masquerade saying it was a health care bill. So in any event, we were going through this bipartisan process, but then the folks who run our politics these days, the people with the capability of putting money into super PACs, decided that that wasn't enough, that they had to fulfill their promise to repeal the Affordable Care Act come hell or high water. So we ended up with a bill in the Finance Committee now, because we had only one hearing, and that was on Monday, in the Finance Committee, that simultaneously made matters worse for the people in the individual market by creating more volatility in that market, and also threw a whole bunch of people off of their insurance by cutting Medicaid. Now remember, the problem that we have out in America, one of them, we've got a lot with our healthcare system, and I'm going to mention that in a sec. There are a bunch of people in America who make too much money to be on Medicaid, but do not make enough money to be able to afford insurance. So our solution to that is to make it more difficult for them, the proposed solution, and at the same time throw a whole bunch of poor people off of Medicaid who we know will never be able to afford insurance because folks who make a lot more money than they do can't get insurance. And that leads me to this point, which is that whether people like the Affordable Care Act or whether they don't, at home has a lot to do with what party they're in. It's not only that, because there are people with pre-existing conditions or who have children with pre-existing conditions who realize that this was their first chance to actually have health insurance. It matters a lot to them. In fact, it's very gratifying to see how many people, how many people's lives have been improved by the Affordable Care Act as a result of this attempt to repeal. We learned that. But in general, people are deeply dissatisfied with the way they and their families intersect with the American healthcare system, whether they support the Affordable Care Act or whether they don't. And the reason for that is because we haven't actually addressed the fundamental issues in our healthcare system that have to do with cost and transparency and predictability. And those are things that we will not be able to address in a partisan way. We have to find a bipartisan way to do it and somehow focus the attention on that. But what has happened is the attention that the American people, like on so many issues, the attention that the American people want us to focus on and the priorities the American people have with respect to healthcare, with respect to climate, with respect to infrastructure, all end up being disintermediated by special interests that have become far stronger in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. And I apologize, I'm now giving you a speech 10 times longer than what I usually do, but I got two more points I want to make. One is, I travel my state all the time, and I often historically I've referred to the Supreme Court's majority opinion in Citizens United. As you say, it's like reading a seventh grader's American government paper. And then I decided that was insulting to seventh graders, so I've stopped saying it. But it is such a pathetic miscomprehension of how our system works. I believe strongly that if our justice from Arizona had still been on the court, who had actually been elected to something and knew how this all worked, we would have never gotten such a childish, ridiculous result. And I could go on at great length about that, but I'm not going to do that. Here's what I'm going to say about it. The court imagined a world of quid pro quo corruption. That's what they set up as the bogeyman here. And so they imagined a world where NERA gives me $5,000. This is the fact pattern. And I go and write a bill for NERA or for the Center for American Progress. And they said, well, that's corruption. That is corruption. So we don't need to change the campaign laws to deal with that. We can punish we can prosecute that already. It's corruption. So then what they asked was, okay, maybe this is now about the appearance of corruption, not actual corruption. And they said, well, let's think about that. Are we concerned about the appearance of corruption? And they said, we're not. We believe that money is speech. They had that ruling in Buckley against Vallejo. And we don't think the appearance of corruption is that big a deal, and so it can't be regulated on that basis. Now, I think just on that basis, they were totally wrong. In other words, the appearance of corruption, in my view, rises to a level that we should be willing to say that billionaires can't give money that doesn't have somebody's name attached to it to super PACs, which parenthetically wasn't even in front of the court, but they pulled it into the decision. Pretext, total pretext. And I would say in Colorado, where the court said in a democracy you can never have enough speech, that was the basis of their opinion. And because money is speech, the corollary to that is in a democracy you can never have enough money, is exactly the opposite of the way people in Colorado see this. There's not a single person that's ever come up to me and said, Michael, the problem with our politics is there's just not enough money in it. But that is the Supreme Court's position. That is their considered position. And the result of that decision and all the avalanche of dark money that has shown up in our politics is, one, degrades people's view and confidence of the government, and it has had an enormous impact on that, which is fine if you're a member of the Freedom Caucus and you think you've been sent here to dismantle the federal government, that you believe that's your job, and having government have a 9% approval rating suits your purposes. That's fine. If you're anybody else that's actually trying to get something done, it complicates the picture. And then the second thing I would say is the court totally missed it because the system is corrupt. But it's not the quid pro quo corruption. It's not the guy going and taking the money and putting it in his icebox, in Louisiana. It is a corruption not of action, it's a corruption of inaction. It's a corruption of bills that aren't written, committee hearings that aren't held, discussions about climate, and thank you, Lindsey Graham, that aren't held for fear that if you step out of line, not out of line with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, not out of line with business interests or with labor interests, but out of line with the ideological convictions of a handful of billionaires that live in this country, that you will end up with $30 million being dropped on your head in the next election. That is what we face. And that is the constraint, a corruption of inaction. You want to know why this has been the least effective Congress that we've seen in forever? That is the reason. And that's why, caps drain the swamp stuff is so important. The overturning Citizens United is so important. Disclosure is so important. I have two other bills that just mentioned in passing. One would ban members of Congress from ever becoming lobbyists. If you've had the privilege to serve in the Senate or serve in the House, you should be willing to say, you know what, I detect the American people are worried that people just come to Washington to get rich being lobbyists, and I'm willing to forego that. That would send a great signal to the country. I am actually very pleased that my colleague Cory Gardner is my co-sponsor of that bill. And then I also have a bill that would say that members of Congress shouldn't raise money from lobbyists while we're in session, which I think would also send an important message. Here's the final point I want to make, and then I'll stop. I am deeply, deeply worried that we have gotten to a point in our politics in D.C., partly for the reasons that I talked about and partly for other reasons, that there are no rules or norms or conditions anymore, that what we are playing is a game of anything goes. Any politics, whatever you can get away with is what the constraint is. And that's not the way the founders set this place up. And I just want to spend a moment on that. Those guys, whatever their faults, were absolute geniuses. And they had no real model for what they were trying to set up. It's not, there were no best practices on how to set up a republic, because there had been no republic over any geography remotely as big as the original colonies or that contained as many people. In fact, people in the debate believed it was impossible for you to have a republic, a self-governing enterprise in an area that was bigger than a tiny city. That was the view. They relied on, the few examples there were, the bad examples of the Roman Republic and of Greek Athenian democracy that weren't perfect for our situation. And what they and they had the rough draft of the Articles of Confederation, but they really relied on each other and the imagination of the other people in that room. And they realized they had strong parochial interests, strong disagreements, but they realized there was a public good that they needed to reach. And they also understood that at the essence of a self-governing enterprise, you would have disagreement. They didn't believe you would have agreement. They thought you would have disagreement. And they thought you would have factions that would have strong disagreements. And they built an extraordinary mechanism for us to resolve our disputes. Today we're using that mechanism to have disputes, not to resolve disputes. They built it to resolve disputes. And when Ben Franklin was asked, standing on the steps of Independence Hall one day, what kind of government are you creating, Mr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic? He famously said, a republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it. Because he knew, since it was self-government, that it was going to be the work of every generation coming after the founders that we're going to decide whether we're going to keep the republic or not. And every generation until now has worked to make that republic more democratic than it was when the founders founded it, and I believe has made it stronger as a result because of the tradition of pluralism that historically we have embraced, but Donald Trump has rejected. That is a story about pluralistic ideas, about pluralistic people, about pluralistic communities that allows us to come together, have the debate, come to some sort of compromise and outcome that can endure. And that's what we have completely lost in Washington, D.C., in my view. And we have to find a way to recapture it. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing what those guys did. First, because it sprang from their imagination. They weren't, as we are, following the shadowy compromises of prior generations of senators that have placed us in a place where all we do every year is reauthorize flood insurance when the Chinese are doing what the Chinese are doing. And geniuses because none of them would have thought we were here, and here we are 230 years later. The 330 million people. We cover an area, not the 13 colonies, but coast to coast in the continental United States. They would never have believed it. The most dynamic economy that humankind has ever known, the biggest capacity for self-defense that any country in the history of the world has ever known. That's what the founders and generations after the founders have given us. And the question is whether in our own time we're going to continue to erode the institutions that are so essential for us to make decisions, or whether we're going to design a system of politics that can actually support the decision-making of those institutions. And I think that is the work that the Center for American Progress is all about, and I think that's the work that the Senate has to be about. We should be sending people here who are going to work to fix these institutions rather than play the cheapest politics of all, which is to light them on fire and then talk about how terrible it all is. So I want to thank you for having me today. Sorry to go on for so long. That's a long speech for me. I apologize. I'll stop. Thank you.
Senator Bennet, thank you so much. My name is Winnie Stackelberg. I'm the Executive Vice President of External Affairs here at CAP. I'm thrilled to have the senator here. You can talk for as long as you want.
I'm done.
Absolutely. Just, you mentioned the bills that you filed. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes just explaining a little bit more about sort of how they work, and not so much in the details of the nuances of the statute, but just like how would they work with respect to your colleagues? What's the problem that you're trying to solve here?
So the first one, I won't go through too much detail on these, but the first one is a bill to overturn Citizens United, and that obviously requires a constitutional amendment. And I'm not for screwing around with the Constitution in general, although one wonders whether the Electoral College may have outlived its usefulness. But that's a fairly straightforward amendment that Tom Udall has that would say that, that Congress and state legislatures can regulate campaign contributions, which historically we always have. Second piece of that is the Disclose Act, which is not a constitutional amendment, but would require disclosure by anybody who runs a political ad in this country. And 8 of 9 I'm known to the children of Colorado as Michael Bennet. I'm not Michael and I'm not Bennet. I'm Michael Bennet. When I was in the school district, I was Bennet. But I'm Michael Bennet because they've all heard I'm Michael Bennet and I approve this message. And this bill would require that sort of disclosure for everyone. And 8 of 9 justices in Citizens United, Justice Thomas being the exception, agreed that disclosure didn't violate the First Amendment. In fact, one of the reasons why I have such a problem with the opinion is that they very clearly believed that we were going to create disclosure. The implication, the very strong implication is that, well, of course, Congress can take care of this by creating disclosure. And they clearly have never met Mitch McConnell or studied his view of this. So those are those bills. The others, the lobbying ban came to me because of a town hall meeting that I had where people were saying, why are all these people lobbyists who were members of Congress? And I went and looked at it and discovered that of the people that leave the Congress but don't retire, over half become lobbyists in Washington, D.C. That sends a terrible message to people, and I think that the least you can do if you've had the privilege to be in one of these jobs is to accept there are plenty of other things to do. You don't have to be a lobbyist. And I think it would send a really important message. For years, I couldn't get a Republican on that bill, but Cory Gardner, as I mentioned, is now on it. And that gives me a lot of hope that we may be able to move that forward. The last one is just the idea is that if we're here, we should be working on our legislative work, and we shouldn't be having lobbyists bundle money for members of Congress during the legislative session while we're considering bills that may be, may have an effect on the interests that the lobbyists represent. So Tom Udall has a number of other bills that I know he's worked on with you guys. We were talking about it this morning. I mean, this whole project, if you could, it seems to me that the way you get people interested in these bills is by getting people interested in the idea of rescuing the institutions that I was just talking about, because then there's a purpose to actually doing the work, to cleaning it up. And so I think it's important for us not to skip that step of the conversation.
Well, it seems so obvious, doesn't it, that you shouldn't accept money from people that you're talking to about legislation. But what do people in Colorado think? I mean, it seems as if
corrupt.
That
They think it's a corrupt system, and they are not. As I said in my remarks, nobody says, there's not a single person I've met who says the problem with politics is there's not enough money in it. I mean, that's their view. There's too much money, and if you live, some of you may not have the wonderful opportunity, and it is a wonderful opportunity, to live in a swing state. But if you live in a swing state, your TV is basically taken away from you from October and the year before until November of the election now. And the ads are negative. The ads are much more negative than they were before. The ads are false. You have no idea who Citizens for Tall Grass and Children with Good Teeth are. You don't know who that is. The names that they use are actually the opposite. I mean, it's a completely Orwellian system. And people just would like to watch the Broncos. And they'd also like to not have their TV taken over fully a year before the election happens. But that's one of the problems when you have unlimited money washing through the system. It breeds contempt for the system. And then when you have that contempt for the system, it makes it harder to actually change the system. And that makes it harder to do the stuff we all really want to work on, which is infrastructure and healthcare and national defense and all that good stuff.
You mentioned Senator Gardner. I want to talk a little bit about partisanship in all of this. In 2002, McCain and Feingold and Shays and Meehan get together famously, and a bill is signed by a Republican president. 2002. 2010, you mentioned the Disclose Act, not bipartisan at all.
Right.
To what extent is partisanship driving the inability to address some of these problems? And if it is a part of the problem, how do you begin to sort of get partisanship to recede so that you can come together on solutions?
It's very, very difficult, because I don't think at its heart, and you hear a lot of people thump their chest around here and talk about the principle they're standing on, but you should scratch the surface of what they're saying. And you should listen hard for the content of what they're saying. Or spend one night, not more than that, spend one night watching the cable TV. You can go back and forth between Fox and MSNBC and scratch the surface of that. And what you find is there's not much content to it. What's driving it is the ideological peculiarity of the money behind the parties. In particular, these days, the Republican Party. We have similar issues on our side. But that's why in past years you've had folks on the DREAM Act who are now on the DREAM Act, although Cory Gardner, I'm very pleased to say, is a co-sponsor of the DREAM Act. You have people who believed that we should be working on climate change. You can't say that anymore. You've got people who, I mean, the list is long, and that's one of the things that's distorted our politics. And so my point is that since it's not really a principal difference, then we have to find a way of addressing what is creating the distortion, which is the money. And that is going to require Republicans and Democrats to come together to do it in an effort, I think, to save the system and be responsive to the American people. Colorado is a third Republican, a third Democratic, and a third Independent. And they have almost no patience for the partisan divisions that are happening here because they think, in general, they're pretty phony. Not that there aren't some disagreements, but those aren't the disagreements that Washington is really spending its time on.
Right. There seem to be so many examples of how the outside influence of special interests and corporate interests distort the incentives of members of Congress and harm the policymaking process. I think you talked about it in the aggregate in your opening remarks. Do you have specific recent examples that stick out in your mind as particularly egregious examples
I
of
think
that
the
interest?
the whole healthcare debate for the last 10 years is a perfect example and an egregious example. I mean, if you really think about the debate on healthcare, and the fact that President Obama had a bill that was based on Heritage Foundation ideas and the work of Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. I mean, those are facts. It's not fake news. It's true. I can't defend the process that passed that bill, and there's a lot of overhang because of that process, which was also, in the end, a partisan vote. It wasn't a partisan process. We had almost countless committee meetings. We had 150 Republican amendments or more that were actually adopted as part of the health care bill. But the overhang from that partisan process has stuck with us, and I think it's important to say that and to understand that that's happened. On the other hand, this attack from the other side that what it represented was a Bolshevik takeover of the United States of America probably and largely turns out not to be true. And there are a lot of people in the country that have benefited from it, 600,000 Coloradans that have health insurance that didn't have it before the bill passed. But we still are struggling with cost. Healthcare in this country costs too much more than it should. And this is not a fanciful problem like so many things we face. It's a real problem in the daily life of people, and in the daily life of small businesses all over this country. It is an extraordinary pain point. And people know, and I know it's not just true in Colorado, people know that they're having to make choices in their own life and in their family's life that nobody else in the industrialized world has to make. And that seems, unfair to them. Now, we can't have some autocrat decide that for us. We have to have the United States Congress fix that. And we're not going to be able to do that as Democrats or Republicans. We're going to have to do that working together. And we're going to have to do, interestingly enough, listen to some of the interests that are part of that to get to a decent result. What we can't do is get dragged along by people who have a set of ideological beliefs that are totally outside the mainstream of America, of what's conventional American political thought, and in particular, in this case, what is a conventional Republican view of the world. I didn't really answer your question, but
no, I mean, we struggle here obviously with what is the next step on healthcare, and I want you to be hopeful that there's a place for us to go, that there's solutions to come together.
So I'm hopeful about the Lamar, Alexander, and Patty thing. It's small, but that's a good start. And I, for one, want to see what we can do to solve this issue for people living in rural Colorado and rural America who don't have access to insurance upon which they can rely. My view is that that comes by providing a public option of some kind and allowing people maybe to buy into Medicare in some way to be able to know that they have health insurance when they're in a broken market. But there's a lot of other stuff we have to do. I mean, how can anybody be against transparency in healthcare, right? That should be something we're working on. Unlike anything else we have in America, virtually, when it comes to healthcare, you have no idea what anything costs. You have absolutely no idea what it costs. And by the time you stop fighting with your insurance company over who's going to pay for it, you don't care anymore until the next time you have to do it. That's something we could fix, and I think that there's no reason that can't be bipartisan. And I believe, I say this to folks that are in the healthcare business, that it is, opacity should not be a business model when it comes to the American people's health care. Whether it's drugs or hospitals or doctors or insurance, we should have complete transparency.
A few years ago, you were chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. You don't have to let us know whether those were the best or the worst years of your lives. But clearly in that role, you were responsible for helping to elect Democratic senators nationwide. Raising the necessary dollars that go into those campaigns on the one hand, and on the other, you've been such a leader on reforms related to special interests and lobbying, and the effort to reorient the system to one that facilitates fair representation. So how do you balance that reform-minded view with the need to raise the huge sums of money from corporate interests in addition to others as chairman of the DSCC?
Yeah, I mean, I think that experience only reinforced my view that we have to change the system. And I wasn't the best couple of years of my life, I'll say that. But you learn a lot about how it all works, and it reinforced that view.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit just to redistricting. Let me ask you a question. The Supreme Court is getting ready to hear an important case on redistricting. And we all know that congressional and state level districts are often drawn to give one political party an unfair advantage against the other. Granted, you're in the Senate and your map is already drawn, but do you have a view on what the best method is for redistricting, whether it's nonpartisan commissions, whether it's a different method?
I think it should be nonpartisan commissions, and I think the districts should be drawn to be as competitive as they can possibly be. Look, even if you were looking at it just from the interest of the parties, which is not how I look at it, I'm looking at it from the interest of the American people. Even if you're looking at it from the interest of the parties, if they want to retain control over a policy direction or a political direction, it clearly doesn't help to have districts where the only people you're talking to are the people in your party. I mean, I think we've learned that over the last 10 years. We should have learned that over the last 10 years. If you have a whole bunch of districts where your only concern is getting primaried from the right or from the left, that's going to make it impossible for people to work together in the middle. I don't think that's the primary cause of our difficulty, but it certainly is adding to it.
And then the steps to address that. I mean, people talk about, sure, I won't accept that kind of money, but you've got to unilaterally disarm. I mean,
on the money part,
yeah,
or the gerrymandering
no,
part?
on the money part.
Yeah, I think that you're not going to. People won't unilaterally disarm, but we need to find a way to build some bipartisan support for what we're trying to do, and I think we need to work very hard to explain to support the American people's impression that the system doesn't work well, which it doesn't, the money part of the system, and that we want to reform it. It's a challenge because the Supreme Court's decision is so broad in Citizens United, and they don't show any signs of understanding the damage they've done to the democracy. But I'll tell you, I'll just finish my answer to say that it's not too much to say that this Citizens United, which begot this terrible dysfunction in the Congress, has now led to a degradation of the rules and the norms that I mentioned earlier that has resulted in, that's a long set of sentences, but that has resulted now in the United States Senate changing the rules for Supreme Court nominees so that now only a 51 vote threshold is required. No longer is a 60 vote threshold required. And that was done in full sight of the American people on, I would argue, a nominee who should not have been filibustered. So the Democrats filibustered. I didn't support that. I can talk more about that if people are interested. But they changed the rules with almost no one noticing it. And what is the result of that now? Now we've got a case where after decades of tradition where Democrats and Republicans voted 80 and 90 for qualified Supreme Court nominees, and qualified Supreme Court nominees came to Washington saying, I'm a moderate, I have an open-minded view of this or that. Whether they did or whether they didn't is something for history to judge. Now, the case is going to be, I'm the most right-wing judge in the country, and you must put me on the court because that's what the base of the Republican Party is saying. Or, I'm the most liberal judge in America, and you must put me on the court because that's the base of my party. And do not even solicit votes from the other party. That's the damage that we've done. We've infected the Supreme Court with the partisanship that we are confronting in Congress.
And is the toothpaste out of the tube and it can't be put back in?
I hope someday that I live long enough to correct the mistake that I made voting to change the rules for nominees for lower courts and for the administration, which we did when Harry Reid was majority leader. I know Harry, if he ever watched, I apologize because he's mad at me for this. But I really think we should have tried to handle that in a different way, because when we did that, Mitch McConnell just pocketed that precedent. And he said, okay, well, we'll see you. And now there's a strong argument to be made that he's the guy in Washington who's outsmarted everybody else, because they may get 3 justices, 51 vote margin, including the judge that could overturn Roe versus Wade. And there won't be anything for us to say about it. So I said on the floor, you may not like the ring of Justice Gorsuch. How do you like the ring of Justice Pruitt? So I think someday maybe we could come together and say this isn't serving the court well, it's not serving the Senate well. It's important for both parties to have a responsibility to move qualified people forward, which is not to say you can't vote against them in the end, or many of you can't. That would be a much better system than the one we have right now.
I'm going to ask one final question and then ask the audience to ask the senator questions. Just without disclosing conversations with your colleagues, what is the reaction to some of these reforms, whether it's your bills or others, in terms of getting lobbies, especially from Republican senator, but from others? I mean, do they explain that they don't support this on substantive grounds? Do they explain they don't support it on political grounds?
I think that people don't, in general, what they do is they sort of evade a responsibility to deal with it until they have to, until it's on the floor and they have to vote, which is something we should be doing, is figuring out how to get these votes on the floor of the Senate. I think that if we could get the lobbying ban to the Senate floor, that it's very likely that would pass. It's a bipartisan bill. It's, we got 2 senators from Colorado who are trying to do it. I think it's quite likely we could get that done. And so I don't want to give up. The other thing is, remember, the president famously ran on draining the swamp, and hey, if he wants to do that, there are a bunch of people like me and others that have plenty of ideas that would actually have an effect on how we do the work here.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask my audience here if they have questions for Senator Bennet, right up here. Great.
Thank you, Senator. Very interesting. Lars Hansen, I'm with LVHA. I'm the Vice President CTO. 2 things come to mind. Okay, one is the Supreme Court is not just Citizens United. It's the equation of money as speech, as you've noted. It's also the idea that corporations are people, which gives the people in the corporations 2 votes instead of 1. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is gerrymandering. And so I don't see, it seems to me we have to fix those basic problems. And I haven't heard anything on this business of corporations are people.
No, I agree. I mean, I think from a political perspective, that's just, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that is to say, in our political system, it makes no sense. I agree with you. And the gerrymandering as well. How to fix it? Well, I think on the gerrymandering part, we need to need to have these nonpartisan commissions do the work at the state level, and I think on the and on the others, I mean, I'm sort of repeating myself. I think there's going to have to be a little civil disobedience here. There are going to have to be some states and some municipalities around the country who start to say, we care about what's on our TVs, you know, and we're going to start insisting that money be spent in a certain kind of way. And one thing we didn't talk at all about, by the way, is social media and the effect of that too, which I'll just park for a second. But that also, for the moment, has had a pretty corrosive effect on our national politics. And somehow we've got to figure out an answer to that. And CAP is much better situated to figure that out than I am, which is why I raise it.
Put it on our list. Yep, up front here.
Hi, Ryan Alexander from Taxpayers for Common Sense. Senator Bennet, nice to see you. There's a series of political scientists who have written a lot about the need for more candid and private conversations among lawmakers, and you know, in effect, for less transparency of the legislative process. And I've had a bunch of conversations with different policymakers and staff that usually come down to, really, there's no shortage of opportunity for backroom deals.
Right.
That's not the problem right now. And I'm just wondering kind of what your perspective is on
So
that.
let me tell you two stories, two totally unrelated stories. So the first one, speaking of backroom deals, the last guy to speak before the delegates, the Constitutional Convention, took their vote on the Constitution was Ben Franklin. And he said, the first thing he said like three things. The first thing he said was, I'm so old that I've gotten to the point where I'm a lot less sure that I'm right about stuff. Which, imagine somebody in the United States Senate saying that today. And of course, what he was saying was, if I, the wisest person in this room, the most experienced person in this room, am willing to say, I don't have a monopoly on wisdom, the rest of you guys ought to be willing to say, I don't have a monopoly on wisdom. Then he said, there are things in this Constitution that I don't like, and I've argued against it, but I'm not convinced that we could ever create a more perfect Constitution than the one that we've created, and I know the people in this room. So I'm skeptical that there are other people that could do a better job than the people in this room. And then the last thing he said, to your point, was, while I have my issues with this deal, I'm not going to go home. He didn't have to go far because he lived in Philadelphia. I'm not going to go home and say publicly what I didn't like about it. And the rest of you, when you vote for this, ought to go home and do the same thing. And the second example, am reminded of the best example in my time in the Senate of what you're talking about, which was the Gang of Eight immigration bill. I was one of the 4 Democrats on the bill, and there were 4 Republicans. We spent 8 months together negotiating that bill. We spent 8 months not in conflict, but in trying to solve each other's political issues. So commonly, I'd see a Republican say to Chuck Schumer, we can't make you do that because labor will go crazy. Or I'd see Chuck say, we can't do that because it'll make the chamber go crazy. And we didn't see border security as something to be traded for a pathway to citizenship or vice versa. We saw both of those things, as I would say the people of Colorado do, as normative goods. And in the end, our rule was the same as Ben Franklin's rule, which was we all said we didn't get everything we wanted. If I had written the bill myself, it would have been different. But we went to the floor and we defended the bill against all the amendments that would have destroyed the bill going forward. And we had an agreement to do that, and we were able to do that. We don't do that anymore. I mean, think about the fact that the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 was introduced by the minority leader of the United States Senate. So these norms have changed. There's no lack of opportunity for people to be able to work together, to meet together, to try to get stuff done. And I'll say, while I'm on the topic of the Gang of Eight, when people say to me sometimes, you guys are terrible, you deserve your 9% or 11% approval rating or whatever it is on the given week, and there's no leadership back there, I have told people for years that I've seen the level of leadership that's needed in this Congress, and it was the leadership provided by Jeff Flake, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and John McCain, the 4 Republicans who sat in that room for 8 months knowing exactly what the base of their party would say about them being there, but being there because it was the right thing to do for the country, and they thought the right thing to do for their party in that order. They could never have seen the rise of Donald Trump. And I hope actually we get back to that now, because and I think about what is happening in my community to people as a result of our not fixing immigration and the president's completely anti-immigrant, anti-pluralist, anti-ahistorical view of these issues. It's all the more reason we should be getting the work done.
Question in the back.
Good to see you again. Michael Feldman, Create Equity. Main speech on the Senate floor about education. Let me take you back to education and fake facts. How do we get back to the Enlightenment society that we started out with, where famously you can have differing opinions, but you can't have your own facts?
So this is, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think this is as important as anything else that I babbled on about. The republic can't work, the democracy can't work if we don't have edited content on which we rely. And it cannot work well if we don't have a free press that is admired. That doesn't mean that it should be agreed with, and it doesn't mean that the free press is infallible. Reporters are human beings, they make mistakes. Newspapers, some have points of view and ideologies that conflict. But as the founders saw it, all that kind of would come together in a conflict, and out of it, the truth would be revealed, the facts would be revealed. And I was asked the other day at a conference in Colorado with Corey Gardner, we were on the panel together with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, they asked, how do we get people to actually focus on the facts? And I said to them, many of them voted for the president, I'm sure, I said, it makes it very hard when the President of the United States every day is calling the leading periodicals and television outlets of this country fake news. All of them fake news. And it's merely because he can't withstand the scrutiny of it. But this is a very important part of our work as a democracy. When I meet with middle school students and high school students, I didn't do this before the era of this President Trump, but I do it now. I ask them, do you write papers in school? Going back to education, I used to be a school superintendent. Do you write papers in school? And if they say no, that leads to a very serious conversation. But if they say yes, which they almost always do, I say, well, tell me about that. Do you do your research on the internet? Yes. And I tell them I didn't. I used to do it in a different way. And I ask them, do you have to distinguish between edited content, curated content, and somebody shooting their mouth off on the internet? And their answer is, of course we do, because we'll get in trouble with our teachers if we're relying on stuff we shouldn't rely on. And it seems to me, and I tell them this, that that's the standard that apply to people that are politicians in Washington, D.C. There's not a law that anybody can pass that can say that, but we should have a mutually reinforcing idea that that's what we're going to do. We're not going to bring to the Senate stuff that's completely made up and fabricated somewhere on the dark recesses of the internet. And by the way, we're especially not going to do it because now we know that the Russians exploited this in the last election in a really material way. We're under attack by them. You meet with the ambassadors from Europe, or I do sometimes, and they will tell you the same thing is happening in their elections. It's never happened as effectively in their elections as it has in our elections, but they worry deeply about it, and it's distorting our system. So I'll finish just by saying that I think it is shameful, in particular, that the president, the White House, not just so this isn't even the Twitter account, the White House put out a list of 100 terrorist attacks that they claimed that journalists hadn't covered. I don't remember why they did that, but they did that. And then all over America, journalists had to put on the front page of their newspapers hyperlinks to the coverage that they had of those attacks. That stuck with me particularly because we know there are journalists who have been beheaded, literally beheaded, in the Middle East, trying to tell us something about ISIS, trying to explain the story in Syria. And the President of the United States is willing to say what he's saying. More than 200 journalists have been killed in Mexico in recent years. If you don't think that's had an effect on the rule of law or on ending corruption, you're crazy. And, you know, this is something we need to think about. We need to do more than think about it. This is a cultural norm that this country needs to reinforce. If this president is going to take the view that he is, the rest of us, and by that I mean not just senators, although I do mean senators, including Republican senators, but school teachers and school children and bank presidents. People should be out there buying their local newspapers. And we need to, on this one, we really do need to resist.
Unbelievable. Your passion, your leadership, your commitment to these issues gives me, and I hope our audience, some optimism that maybe not in the next year or the year after that, but soon, we'll get on the right side and
what choice
rebalance.
do we have? No choice. I mean, we can either give up or make it better, and we've got to find a way to make it better.
Well, with
That's
someone
all.
like Senator Bennet in the Senate and doing his good work, we will make it better. Thank you all,
Thank
and thank
you.
you, Senator Bennet, for that. Yeah, it was great.